Walton's Mountain. Just hearing the name takes you back. The porch light, the goodnights drifting down the hallway, a family that felt a little like yours, maybe more than yours. But the people who built that world were living very different lives off screen. Some were quietly struggling, some were walking away from things no one understood, and some were carrying a kind of pain you'd never guess from their face on Thursday nights. Tonight, we're going to tell those stories, slowly, the way they actually happened. Richard Thomas. John Boy. You probably remember him as John Boy, the soft voice at the end of every episode, the older brother everyone wished they had, the one writing in his notebook by the window while the rest of the house went to sleep. And for a while, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to.
I guess sometimes I feel a little foolish. Feeling foolish can be fun.
The Emmy, the magazine covers, the letters from families who said he felt like one of their own. But behind that notebook, something was starting to shift. He was still young, the checks were big, the fan mail never stopped, and yet, quietly, he was beginning to worry about something nobody around him was talking about. What if John Boy was the last person he ever got to be?
The Waltons was the program we all tuned into to feel bad about our childhoods.
He'd seen it happen to other actors, that slow, quiet, disappearing act where the character eats the person. And the longer he stayed on that porch, the harder it was going to be to ever walk off it as himself. Then one day, he made a choice nobody on that set saw coming. He packed up John Boy and left the mountain while the show was still a hit. And yet on screen, you never felt any of it. You saw a young man writing by candlelight, loving his family, promising to come home. That was the gift he gave us before he went. But he wasn't the only one on that set holding something back. Michael learned Olivia Walton. Most people remember her as Olivia, the mother at the stove, the woman whose voice could calm a whole room without ever being raised. For a lot of us watching back then, she was what a mother was supposed to sound like.
We all need one now and again, just to say, I'm me, and not worry about anything.
But behind that calm face, she was fighting something most viewers never suspected. And she wasn't fighting it after fame found her, she was fighting it before she ever stepped onto Walton's Mountain. For years, she had been hiding something no one at home could see. Something that had nearly cost her everything by the time she was in her early 30s. It was a bottle. Alcohol had slowly taken over her life long before the cameras found her. And when she walked onto that set to play the steadiest mother on television, she was a woman barely holding it together in private. What pulled her back wasn't the fame or the paychecks. It was the man playing her husband, Ralph.
Somebody well-educated and traveled who could draw him out, make him relax a little.
He saw it in her. He'd been there himself. And quietly, off camera, he helped her find her way out. And yet on screen, she was Olivia. Pouring coffee, kissing foreheads, saying goodnight. Nobody at home had any idea the woman tucking that TV family in was fighting to stay sober one more day. But the man who helped her was carrying a wound of his own. Ralph Waite, John Walton Sr. Most of us remember him as John, the father, the steady one, the man at the head of the table whose word was final, but whose eyes were always kind.
I'm sorry, but you can't. You're just 13 years old.
If you grew up without a father like that, he probably felt like the one you would have wanted. But long before he ever played a father on television, Ralph had already lost something no man should have to lose. Years before the show, he had a little girl. Bright, full of life, the kind of child who makes a house feel like a house. And then, very quietly, she got sick. It was leukemia. She was 9 years old. Ralph had been a minister before he was an actor, a real one who had stood in front of real congregations and talked about faith. But after he lost his daughter, something in him couldn't find those words anymore.
Can I kiss you goodnight?
I couldn't get to sleep without it.
The sermon stopped. The church doors closed behind him. He walked out into the world looking for somewhere to put all that grief, and he found it in acting. Every time John Walton hugged one of those kids on screen, there was a real father behind those eyes who knew exactly what it felt like to lose one. And yet he never let it darken the role. He gave us the father he wished he could have kept being. Judy Norton, Mary Ellen Walton. Mary Ellen was the spirited one, the daughter who never quite fit the quiet mold of the mountain. The girl who wanted to be a nurse, who fell in love too fast, who argued with her mother and made up by morning.
Mary Ellen, you were supposed to mop this floor.
I'll do it right now, Mama.
I did it.
Well, I'm sorry, I just forgot.
That's the third time this week.
And for years, that's exactly who America wanted her to be. The good girl in the long dress, the wholesome daughter on the wholesome show. But behind that long dress, something inside Judy was starting to push back. She had grown up on that set, stepped onto Walton's Mountain as a child, and walked off it as a woman.
What I started running into after they sort of had me married and have a kid, was like hanging around the house, waiting for some man to make me important.
And by the time the camera stopped rolling, she was carrying a quiet kind of frustration most viewers never picked up on. What do you do when the whole country only knows you as somebody's daughter? For a long time, she tried to play along. She smiled in the interviews, she showed up to the reunions. Then one day, she made a choice that surprised a lot of the people who grew up watching her. She posed for a magazine the wholesome girl on the mountain was never supposed to pose for. It wasn't rebellion, it was a woman quietly trying to remind the world, and maybe herself, that she was more than the character she'd been since she was 14. But the boy who grew up beside her disappeared from the spotlight in a way almost nobody noticed. David Harper, Jim Bob Walton. Then there was Jim Bob, the youngest brother, the kid with the airplane dreams.
The childhood on the Waltons was great because having a movie studio as a playground is like the ultimate fantasy.
The one always trailing a few steps behind the older boys, trying to keep up. If you were the youngest in your family, he was probably the one you watched the closest. He was barely 10 years old when he stepped onto that set, a little boy from Texas, suddenly living inside the most famous family in America.
We used to have nicknames for all of ourselves. So Mary Ellen was Harry Mellon. I think mine was Hand Job or something.
But here's the strange part. After the cameras stopped rolling, David did something almost none of the other Walton kids did. He walked away from all of it. Not in anger, not in some big Hollywood story, he just stopped. The audition slowed down, the phone calls thinned out, and one day, the boy who had spent his whole childhood on a soundstage decided he didn't want to be an actor anymore.
You'll learn to love it, Grandma. All you do is put in a nickel and you can hear your favorite song.
He didn't chase the conventions, he didn't sell his story to the magazines. He just stepped quietly off the mountain and built a life most of us will never see the inside of. Somewhere along the way, he had figured out something a lot of child stars never do, that the safest place for him was as far away from a camera as he could get. But not every Walton kid was able to step away that quietly. Mary Beth McDonough, Erin Walton. Erin was the middle daughter, the pretty one with the soft eyes who always seemed a little caught between her older sister and her younger one. The girl who blushed when the boys came around. She was 11 years old when she stepped onto that mountain.
My dad always described it as buying your first ticket to the Irish sweepstakes and winning. It was my very, very first audition.
Same age as a kid in the 5th grade. And for 9 years, the entire country watched her grow up. For a while, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. The fan letters, the friendships with the other Walton kids that lasted decades. But behind those soft eyes, something was beginning that she wouldn't fully understand for years. When the show ended, Mary Beth wanted to be seen as a woman, not a child. She wanted roles that didn't put her in a long dress on a porch. And in the middle of all of that, she made a personal decision, a quiet one, that she thought would help her start a new chapter. She had no way of knowing it would change her body in ways no doctor warned her about. She was tired in ways she couldn't explain. She hurt in ways that didn't make sense. It was lupus. And the hardest part wasn't the diagnosis. It was the slow realization that the choice she had made years earlier may have been quietly connected to it the whole time. Eric Scott, Ben Walton. Ben was the middle son, the dreamer with the business ideas, the brother who was always cooking up some scheme that was going to make the family rich by next Tuesday. Half the time it ended in a lecture from his father.
I don't think that the producers had as much opportunity to develop the characters with the kids as well as they could have.
The other half in a laugh around the kitchen table. He was just a teenager when he stepped onto that mountain. For a while, the world assumed he'd do exactly what the other young actors were doing. Stay in Hollywood, chase the next show, ride the fame as far as it would go. But somewhere along the way, Eric started thinking about something most child actors never let themselves think about. What happens when the show ends and the phone stops ringing?
Was there kissing going? Oh, sure. I think that all of us were doing a little kissing along the way.
He'd seen it. The young faces who were everywhere one summer and gone the next. And Eric quietly decided he wasn't going to let that be him. So he made a choice that surprised a lot of people. While the rest of Hollywood was chasing the next audition, Eric was learning a real business. The kind with trucks and clients and invoices and quiet, ordinary days. No spotlight, no applause, just work. Maybe the truth is he had been a businessman the whole time. We just thought he was acting. Cammie Kotler, Elizabeth Walton. Some of you might still picture her as Elizabeth, the baby of the family, the little one with the big eyes and the small voice, always tucked somewhere between her older sisters, asking the questions the grown-ups didn't always know how to answer.
I'm not gonna have any babies. What are you gonna have, Elizabeth? Puppies!
She was barely 7 years old when she stepped onto that set. Most of us at that age were learning how to ride a bike. She was learning how to hit a mark in front of millions of people. But behind that little voice, something quiet was already taking shape.
One where I guess he's putting Elizabeth to bed, and I had my braids in, and he undoes my braids and he recites a poem to me.
She was watching everything. While the older kids were thinking about their next audition, Cammie was paying attention to the grown-ups around her, the teachers on set, the way her own family kept her grounded, the careful decisions her parents made about her money and her schooling. What does a child star do when she grows up and decides she doesn't want to be a star at all? For Cammie, the answer was almost the opposite of what you'd expect. She walked into a classroom, not as an actress visiting one, but as a real teacher. The kind who shows up every morning with a lesson plan and a coffee cup. Maybe that's the rarest ending of all. A child star who grew quietly into something better. John Walmsley, Jason Walton. Then there was Jason, the middle brother with the guitar, the one with the quiet smile and the song always half finished in his head. The Walton kid who'd rather be on the porch with an instrument than anywhere else in the world.
She was very, very supportive of my music and encouraged me to do that.
He was about 16 when he stepped onto that set, a kid who had actually been born across the ocean in a small town in England. Here's the part most viewers never realized. That wasn't acting. The music you heard him play on that show, those weren't somebody else's fingers off camera. That was John. He had been playing since he was a little boy, long before any casting director knew his name. Every scene with that guitar wasn't a job. It was the one part of the day that felt completely his. But behind the soft smile, something was beginning to weigh on him. He could feel the show ending before it ended. And quietly, John started asking himself a question most actors never ask. What if the thing I love most isn't acting at all? So when the cameras finally packed up for the last time, he put the acting down and he picked the guitar back up. He spent years quietly building a life in music, writing, producing, playing for other people instead of in front of them. Ellen Corby, Grandma Esther Walton. For a lot of you, she'll always be Grandma, the small woman with the sharp tongue and the soft heart, the one who could scold you and bless you in the same breath. She was already in her 60s when she stepped onto that mountain. Most actresses her age were quietly disappearing from the business. She was just getting started in the role of her life. For a while, everything was exactly the way it should have been. The Emmy wins, the fan letters from people who said she reminded them of someone they'd lost. But behind that warm grandmother on the porch, something was about to change in a single afternoon. She was at home, just an ordinary day, and then her body did something she couldn't stop. It was a stroke, a bad one. The kind that takes your words before you understand they're leaving. Most actresses would have quietly stepped away. Ellen didn't want that. She came back. Even though her speech wasn't the same, even though every line she delivered now took something out of her the audience would never see. The writers shortened her dialogue, the cast gathered closer around her in the scenes, and week after week, the woman who had nearly lost her voice kept finding it again, one word at a time. Maybe the bravest thing she ever did wasn't acting at all. Maybe it was just showing up. Peggy Ray, Rose Burton. If you watch the later seasons, you'll remember her as Rose, the warm aunt who came into the family when the family needed her most, the woman with the easy laugh who quietly stepped into a kitchen that had lost some of its light. She wasn't there from the beginning, but by the time she left, it felt like she always had been. She was almost 60 when she joined the show. For decades, Peggy had been one of those faces you knew without knowing the name. A character actress. The friendly neighbor in one show. The kind aunt in another. The woman at the grocery counter who got one good line and made the whole scene work. But behind that easy laugh, there was something the audience never picked up on. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work. What does it feel like to spend your whole life being everybody's favorite supporting character and never the center of your own story? When the call came for the Waltons, something shifted for her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just passing through somebody else's family. She was being asked to belong to one. And Rose became one of those rare late arrival roles that audiences took into their hearts almost immediately. She gave the mountain one of its last great warm presences. Joe Conley, Ike Godsey. You'll know him the moment you see him. Ike. The storekeeper, the man behind the counter at the little general store where the whole community came together. The friend who knew everyone's name, everyone's order, and probably most of everyone's secrets. He was in his mid-40s when he stepped onto that set. And here's the part that surprised a lot of people. Acting wasn't even his only job. While the rest of America thought of him as the gentle storekeeper on the mountain, Joe was quietly running real businesses on the other side of town. Real estate, companies. He was living two lives at once. The soft-spoken shopkeeper on screen and the exhausted businessman at home. But behind that gentle face, something was beginning that no one, not even Joe himself, would recognize until it was too late. It started small, the little forgettings, a name that didn't come when he reached for it, a line he had to look at twice, except they didn't go away. It was dementia, the cruelest kind of slow goodbye there is, the kind that takes a man one memory at a time. First the small things, then the names of the shows he'd been on, then the faces of the people he'd worked beside for years, and eventually, the family he loved most. The man who had spent his whole career remembering other people's lines was slowly losing his own. Earl Hamner Jr., the voice behind the mountain. You never really saw his face, but if you watched the show back then, you knew his voice. It was the warm, slow, gentle voice that opened every episode and closed every single night. The voice that said goodnight to the family after the lights went out in the windows. The voice that, for a lot of us, became the sound of Thursday evenings in America. That voice belonged to a man named Earl. And here's the part most viewers never knew. The Waltons weren't made up. They were his family. The mountain, the mill, the long kitchen table, all of it came from a real little boy who had grown up in a real small town in Virginia, in a house with too many mouths to feed. Earl was the oldest. He was the one who watched his father walk miles home in the cold so the children would have something on Christmas morning. He never forgot it. And for a long time, that memory was the engine behind everything he wrote. But behind that warm voice, something quieter was wearing on him. He was carrying the weight of an entire show's heart on his shoulders. While the rest of television was getting louder and harder and meaner, Earl was the one fighting to keep his mountain gentle. He kept telling stories until the very end of his life. No scandals, no loud exits, just a quiet man who had given a country a place to come home to on Thursday nights. And then, when his own story was finished, slipped gently off the same mountain he had spent his whole life building. Will Geer, Grandpa Zebulon Walton. He was the one you never forgot, the twinkle in the eye, the one with the stories, the one sneaking off with the grandkids when Esther wasn't looking.
Times of the Depression, when the big cities they were selling apples.
If you had a grandfather who made the whole day feel a little lighter just by walking into the room, he probably reminded you of him. But behind that warm old man on the porch was a life most viewers would have been stunned to hear about. Long before he ever set foot on Walton's Mountain, Will had been erased from Hollywood. In the 1950s, he was called before a congressional committee and asked to name names of people he'd known in left-wing political circles. He refused. And just like that, the work stopped. The studios quietly agreed not to hire him. He lost his house, he lost his marriage, he lost nearly a decade of his career. So he did something most actors never would. He built his own theater in a canyon in California and planted every single flower Shakespeare had ever written about. That's where he survived. That's where he waited. He was already 70 years old when the Waltons found him. And the man who had been frozen out of Hollywood for almost 20 years suddenly became one of the most beloved grandfathers in America. He used to say, if you live long enough, everything good will happen to you. Even a television series. But his body was starting to slow down, and after the 6th season, he quietly passed away at home while his family sang the old folk songs he used to sing with Woody Guthrie. The writers wrote Grandpa's death into the show. Some of the tears on that episode weren't acting at all. But the woman who came onto that mountain a few seasons in was carrying a very different kind of secret. Ronnie Claire Edwards, Corabeth Godsey. For a lot of you, she was the spice in all that sweetness. Ike's wife, the storekeeper's better half, the woman who ran that general store like a fortress.
Came with the territory, you know, you just had to know.
The one who said, "No credit, Mr. Godsey," like it was written in scripture. If you ever lived in a small town with a woman who knew everybody's business and most of their weaknesses, she probably reminded you of her. But here's what most viewers never realized. The woman who seemed born to play that part didn't even start acting professionally until she was already past 30. She grew up in Oklahoma City, took her time finding her way, and by the time she walked onto...
And I am so touched by
Walton's Mountain, she had already lived a whole life most viewers never heard about. She joined the show in the 3rd season, and from the very first episode, she understood exactly what she was there to do. Because of all that sweetness, she said, what the show needed was a little spice. She was proud of it. Strangers would shout at her in department stores. Women would boo her from across a parking lot, and she would smile every time because it meant she'd done the job right. But behind that sharp tongue was a woman almost nobody on that set fully knew. She wrote plays, she wrote books, she wrote a memoir with a title only she could have given it, The Knife Thrower's Assistant, Memoirs of a Human Target. She kept performing long after the show ended, stage, television, everything. And then one night in Texas, at 83, she quietly went to sleep in her own bed and never woke up. But not everyone who passed through that mountain got that kind of gentle ending. One of them, barely a young man when he stood in front of that church, was going to be taken from the world in a way nobody saw coming. John Ritter, Reverend Matthew Fordwick. You might not place him on the Waltons right away. He was only there for the first few seasons. The young minister, Reverend Fordwick. The nervous man in the collar who stood in front of the church trying to find the right words for a family that was already full of them. He was barely 24 years old. It was one of his very first steady jobs. And then, a few years later, the country learned his name. Three's Company, the Pratfalls, the Emmy, the Golden Globe. A kind of physical comedy that hadn't really been on television like that before and hasn't quite been there since. Don Knotts called him the greatest physical comedian alive. Most of America just called him Jack. But behind that
one man, and everybody but me had brown eyes.
That laugh, John was carrying something he didn't fully understand. His father, Tex Ritter, had died years earlier of what everyone called a heart attack. And quietly, for decades, John had wondered what that meant for him. He would tell people later he worried about his own heart. He just never knew why. Years later, he was on the set of another show, 8 Simple Rules, rehearsing a scene on the Disney lot. He started sweating, chest pain. They rushed him across the street to the same hospital he had been born in 54 years earlier. The doctors thought it was a heart attack. It wasn't. It was an aortic dissection, a hidden tear in the largest artery in his body, a condition he had been born with, the same condition that had quietly killed his father 30 years earlier, and nobody had ever caught it. He died that night, 6 days before his 55th birthday. And yet on screen, he's still that young minister on Walton's Mountain, making the whole room feel a little lighter just by being there. He was one of the first gifts that show ever gave us, and one of the ones we lost the soonest.